Okay, welcome to this fifth and final primer for A Time for Trumpets, and let's talk about combat. So during your combat phase, you attack enemy units. The sequence is laid out on player card 3A. Now basically each unit can only attack once, and each enemy hex can only be attacked once per core. That means that you can potentially attack a hex with one core once, and then later attack that same enemy hex with a different core. And during the combat sequence, you basically nominate attackers and supporting units and aircraft to attack an enemy hex, one at a time. Part of this involves assigning artillery. And let's go through these artillery rules, because there's a fair bit here. First, German Nebelwerfers can only be fired in support of German attacks, not defense. Field artillery, however, can be used in either attack or defense. Now, German field artillery can only either attack or defense in a turn, and you use the fired markers to kind of manage that. US field artillery, however, can fire in each player segment, both in the German player segment and then again in the US or Allied player segment. Now, if an army echelon or core echelon field artillery unit fires defensively on the German turn, you place a fired marker on them, and this mainly means that they can't rest during the US turn. They must be active. This is army echelon and core echelon field artillery. However, division, brigade, and any Kampfgruppe field artillery that are resting may fire in support of their formation on the defense. Now, you place fired markers, as I said, to show that these attacks have been performed. For the Allies, as I said, these are removed at the end of player segment, at each end of player segment. For the Germans, these fired markers are only removed at the end of turn segment. This gives the Allies an advantage for their artillery. Now, Nebelwerfers may fire at adjacent enemy units. Field artillery, however, cannot fire at all when enemy units are adjacent. And there is no fire at all if field artillery group headquarters have been eliminated during the course of the combat round. Now, for Nebelwerfers and field artillery to fire, a combat unit of the same formation, whether it's division, corps, or army echelon level unit, must be adjacent to the target for them to fire. German Nebelwerfers represent sort of Nebelwerfer battalions, and they're organised into brigades. And this is where it gets a bit tricky. All the battalions of a Nebelwerfer brigade must target the one hex. And Nebelwerfer brigades of different corps may not participate in the same attack. To work out the strength of these Nebelwerfers in combat, you simply consult the attack support chart and apply the worst condition to that combat. You don't multiply if more than one apply. Likewise, you add the field artillery combat factor per the attack support chart. Combine these all together to determine the combat factor total that you're adding to combat. Now, there are also, I'll point out, there are rules for bombardment, shock, and artillery parks there, part of the advanced game, and I won't cover them here. Basically, you designate your artillery and your Nebelwerfers, calculate their combat factors, you add these to your combat units and aircraft, and determine combat factors on attack and defense, divide the attacker factors by the defender factors, round down in favor of defenders to determine an odds ratio. Then you, once you've got that odds ratio on the chart, you compare the ER value of the best attacker against the best defender. The winner gets a 1 dice roll modifier in their favor. There are some other DRMs that apply as well. You apply any relevant column shifts for air, artillery, terrain, weapons effects, and so forth. One thing to keep in mind early is that throughout much of the 16th and the 17th of December, German attacks or defences that include a Tiger tank receive a favourable column shift. Now, in addition, normal defenders benefit from night combat, but German units of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Kampfgruppe Piper, 2nd SS Panzer Division, and the 2nd Panzer Division receive a favourable night shift when on the attack. This is outlined on chart player aid 4A. Now, with all those modifiers and shifts worked out, you'll determine your sort of column and your modifiers. You'll roll both a red and a white die to determine the combat result. Now, both die are separately modified by the same relevant die roll modifiers. The red die determines possible combat attrition on the attacker. There may be no effect, But you read this to the left of the slash on the combat results table, and yeah, it only applies if there's a red highlighted result in that area. Now, the white die determines the combat results, which is to the right of the slash. Defenders apply their results first, assigning losses and performing retreats, consulting the relevant step loss charts. Then the attacker applies their results, consulting the charts again. And generally, when taking step losses, units flip, and most combat units have just 2 steps. But a lot of AFVs have multiple steps, up to 5 for Tiger 2s and 6 steps for allied medium tank formations. And the step loss charts help track that. Now, I won't go through all the combat results. Most of them are explained fairly clearly on the charts. I will point out, though, that a counterattack marks the defender with a CA marker like this. Let's imagine there was a German defender adjacent. They attacked. Counterattack result, you mark the defender like that. You won't place this if the defenders are in a strong point or a fort. They ignore that result. And this means that on the defender's turn, they must either withdraw or counterattack the initial attackers. An engage result effectively locks these forces in combat. This varies depending on the unit types. Some unit types must remain locked; they won't be able to withdraw. Other units can either refight or withdraw. Now, if any defenders remain engaged on the original attacker's next turn, in other words, they haven't withdrawn, they must refight the original defenders. Now, for both engagement and counterattack, the relevant forces can bring in extra help for those subsequent fights. For both engagement and counterattacks, if the affected units can't withdraw nor attack for any reason when required, they are eliminated instead. Now, on the off chance that defenders with a CA or an engage marker are attacked again by a different enemy core, remember I said that different core can attack the same hex, then you simply remove the relevant markers and cancel their effects. All right, let's talk about retreats. So retreats will typically be 1 to 4 hexes long, as specified in the combat results. Any deployed headquarters and in-battery artillery and Nebelwerfers that are forced to retreat flip to their march side, retreat, and they become disrupted as well. Now, units generally spend those 1 to 4 hexes by retreating first to a valid supply road, then towards a friendly supply source. Now, keep in mind, they're counting, as they retreat, they're counting the road hexes they retreat, not necessarily hexes away from the combat. And any isolated units can retreat in any direction. Remember what I said about Primer 4, about enemy zones of control forcing the elimination of some units, and stacking in this retreat, or as a result of this retreat, may possibly force disruption and elimination, so be mindful of that. Also, enemy zones of control can cancel the ability of a road to serve as a supply road for the purposes of retreat. So if they have to retreat to a supply road, and this is not a supply road, they may have to consider other road networks in their area that they have to retreat towards. Now, if the defender is eliminated or retreats, the attacker may advance, but the length of their advance varies depending on the retreat result and the nature of the advancing units as per the relevant chart. Now, they can move up to that advance limit on this chart in hexes, provided they don't exceed their regular movement factor. So they're spending their regular movement factor in the advance up to their movement factor printed on the counter, but also up to the number of hexes shown on this chart. Now, the first hex in their advance must be where the defender vacated and can ignore zones of control, but any extra hexes can be in any direction, but must adhere to those zone of control requirements that I've explored before. And I mentioned overrun in Primer 4, and the overrun of headquarters and artillery units only is possible by AFVs during the advance after combat. And those defending units are eliminated immediately upon that type of overrun. This is possible for most formations in daylight turns, and additionally for the 1st SS Panzer Kampfgruppe Piper, 2nd SS Panzer and 2nd Panzer during night turns also. Now, in addition to the standard movement and combat rules that we've covered, there are a few additional tactical options you can employ in a time for trumpets. Now, you can't use these during an engagement, nor with any shocked attackers, and you must declare the use of these tactics before resolving the attack. Now, the first tactic is an Ardennes 44 Blitz. So instead of engaging in regular combat, on a clear daylight turn, you can declare a blitz to slip past defenders. Attackers must include at least one infantry and one frontline panzer or tank unit. Attacking reconnaissance units provide a -1 dice roll modifier, while defending reconnaissance units provide a +1 dice roll modifier to this roll. The attacker, after these odds are all worked out, the attacker must be at 2-to-1 odds or better, and then you use basically the Blitzkrieg attack table instead of the regular CRT. If the odds are below that 2-to-1, you must shift back to resolving a normal attack. Your tactic is cancelled. The second tactic is called a Tigers in the Mist attack, and it's used on fog, snow, and night turns, and again allows the attacker to slip past these defenders. The attacker must include at least one frontline panzer or tank unit. If the attacker chooses not to commit artillery, then the defender also can't commit artillery. They're shocked, they're not given the opportunity to do so. And likewise, if the attacker uses no air, the defender can use no air support. And in this tactic, attacking recon provides a -2 dice roll modifier, while defending recon provides a +2 dice roll modifier. And this type of attack also uses that Blitzkrieg table, but with an additional column shift to the right. And again, if the odds end up below 2-to-1, return to a normal attack. Now, the results on this table advise the attacker to advance 1 to 4 spaces, and most frontline combat units can do so in any direction. Now, the defender in this type of tactic remains stationary. They don't retreat and they don't take hits. So these tactics require careful planning, as you can't advance into the zone of control of the unit defending in that attack. Those defending units remain stationary, and you must also stop upon moving into other zones of control. So you're almost bouncing off the defenders in an effort to sort of breeze past them and get this extra blitz movement. Once all combat is complete, you remove attacker and abort markers, you remove ground combat support aircraft, but most other markers will remain in place for now. The final step in each cause activation is the exploitation segment. And this is where units in reserve can be repositioned at half their movement factor, and where leaders can release units in reserve for exploitation movement. This is detailed in the leader section, and I won't go into detail on that. At the end of your player's turn, you resolve an end of turn segment. Basically, this is where you administer construction markers, including improved positions, strong points, roadblocks, and bridges. The Americans also have the option to withdraw certain artillery units, as detailed in 60.5. At the end of the German segment, the Allied player removes most of their fired markers from their artillery units only, as I said, with the exception of Army and Corps Echelon artillery units, which are only removed at the mutual end of turn segment. Fired markers that are placed on headquarters remain to indicate that they can't rest, that they're fired. Now, at the end of the US turn, the game proceeds to the mutual end of turn segment for more basically administration. You update fatigued and resting markers, adjust disruption, shock, rubble, ferries, and many other markers, and that's basically the end of the turn and the end of the rulebook. So folks, as I've said, I haven't covered everything in these primers. I've skipped over a few optional and advanced rules and many exceptions, such as information on reserves, leader abilities, artillery parks, and bombardment, shock. But hopefully you get a sense of how this game flows, and hopefully this has been of value and has made a time for Trumpets a little more accessible. Thanks everyone.